Hey, before we begin, if you're here because the world feels too loud and you need something quiet and true to carry you towards sleep, then you found the right place. Take a moment to like the video if this kind of calm, historical storytelling is what you come back for. And subscribe if it genuinely speaks to you. Only if it does. Drop a comment before you drift off and tell us where you found this video. A late night search, a recommendation, an algorithm that read your mood correctly at midnight. We love knowing how you arrived. Now, turn down the lights, pull the blanket up a little, and let's go back to the edge of a harbor, somewhere in Spain, somewhere in the early 1500s, on a morning when the tide was right and the wind had finally shifted, and a group of men were preparing to sail off the edge of the known world. Picture that harbor. It might be Palos de la Frontera, the small port in Andalusia where Columbus had departed just years before, or Seville, where the river Guadalquivir opened westward, and the smell of pitch and salt and timber hung in the morning air. The docks were crowded in the early hours before sailing, carts unloading final provisions, casks of salted meat being rolled across stone quays, sacks of hardtack bread stacked against the hull. Ropes were coiled and recoiled. Sails were inspected for tiers. Men argued quietly over tools and supplies, and the proper arrangement of things in holds that would hold everything 100 people needed to survive for months. The city rose behind all of it. Whitewashed houses, the distant sound of church bells, the smell of bread baking in a bakery that those men would not smell again for a very long time. Somewhere in all of that noise and preparation, a man laced up his boots and said goodbye to someone. Maybe a wife, standing at the edge of the dock with her arms crossed over her chest, in the particular way people hold themselves when they are trying not to cry. Maybe a brother or an old friend, or no one at all. And then he walked up the gangplank, and the ship swallowed him into its cramped and wooden world, and the harbor grew smaller behind him, and eventually Europe disappeared entirely into the haze. This is the story of what happened next. Not the discovery, not the conquest, not the names that got written into history books. This is the story of the voyage itself, of the weeks and months spent on the open Atlantic, of the food that rotted and the water that turned green, and the men who died quietly and were buried in the sea. It is the story of what the crossing actually cost the people who made it possible, and whose names we have mostly forgotten. The world of oceanic exploration that these sailors entered had only just been opened. Christopher Columbus had crossed the Atlantic for the first time in 1492, departing from the Canary Islands in early September and reaching the Bahamas 71 days later. That voyage proved something that Europe had only theorized, that the ocean could be crossed, that it had a far side, that something lay beyond the horizon that stretched endlessly west. Within a decade, Spanish and Portuguese ships were crossing regularly, probing the coastlines of a world that European maps had never contained. By the early 1500s, the Atlantic had become a highway, though a brutal and unpredictable one. Dozens of ships made the crossing each year, followed by hundreds, and eventually by thousands. Every one of them carried men who were betting their lives on wooden hulls and canvas sails and the imperfect science of celestial navigation. The men who signed up for these voyages were not, as a rule, the brave and noble adventurers that later histories preferred to imagine. They were mostly ordinary people pushed into extraordinary circumstances by the usual forces: poverty, desperation, the absence of other choices. A typical crew on a Spanish Atlantic crossing in the early 16th century included experienced sailors who had worked coastal trading routes and knew the basics of seamanship, but who had never attempted anything remotely approaching an oceanic crossing. It included soldiers, sometimes, who had been redirected from land campaigns toward maritime service and had no particular aptitude for the water. It included former criminals, occasionally, offered pardons in exchange for service on voyages where the survival rates were uncertain enough that finding willing men was genuinely difficult. And it included the simply young and poor, teenagers and men in their 20s who had grown up in the fishing villages of Andalusia and Galicia and Portugal's Atlantic coast, and who understood the sea in the way that people understand things they have lived beside all their lives without necessarily understanding what it would be to be swallowed by it. The pay was not generous. A Spanish common sailor in the early 1500s might earn around 800 to 1,000 maravedis per month, roughly the equivalent of a modest land laborer's wages, but with considerably more risk attached. What drew many men wasn't the monthly wage, but the promise of what came after, a share of whatever was discovered, the possibility of trading opportunities in the new lands, the vague and appealing idea that a man could come back from the New World transformed, richer, with a story that would last the rest of his life. For the truly desperate, it was simpler than that. Signing on meant eating. It meant a guaranteed ration of food and water for the duration, however inadequate. And for men who might otherwise go hungry on land, that was reason enough. The ships that carried them across were marvels of their age, and utterly insufficient for the task, simultaneously. By the early to mid-1500s, the primary vessels making the Atlantic crossing were the carrack, called the nau in Spanish and nau in Portuguese, and the galleon, which was just beginning to emerge as the dominant design for oceanic travel. Columbus had made his famous 1492 crossing in a small fleet that included one carrack, the Santa Maria, and two caravels, the Nina and the Pinta. The Santa Maria, his flagship, was roughly 19 meters long and displaced around 108 tons, smaller than some modern fishing trawlers, and it carried a crew of approximately 40 men. The caravels were smaller still. Later Atlantic ships were often larger, with some carracks reaching 300 or 400 tons and crewed by 100 men or more. But the scale remained, by any modern standard, astonishing in its smallness. 100 people confined to a wooden hull, no longer than the length of a basketball court, with provisions for months, crossing 3,000 miles of open ocean. The carrack was a sturdy vessel for its time, built to handle the heavy swells of the open Atlantic, rather than the calmer waters of Mediterranean trade. 3 masts carried a combination of square sails and lateen sails, triangular rigged on the rearmost mast, and this combination allowed the ship to sail reasonably efficiently even when the wind shifted. The hull was deep enough to carry substantial cargo and provisions, high enough at the stern to provide some shelter for the captain and senior officers. Below the main deck, the hold housed barrels of water and wine and food in organized tiers, and above it, in the cramped and poorly lit space between decks, lived the ordinary sailors. The galleon, which gradually replaced the carrack through the mid to late 16th century, was longer and lower and faster, with a reduced forecastle that cut down wind resistance. Both types leaked. Both types moved constantly in ways that never became entirely familiar. Both types were, in the words of the merchant and writer William Hodges, writing somewhat later but describing conditions that had not changed much, places where salt seas and salt victuals killed 10 times more men than any sword ever did. The ship that a common sailor lived on was nothing like the popular image of an exploration vessel. There was no comfortable berth waiting below. There were no private quarters, no partitions between individuals, no surface that was not shared. Common sailors slept where they could find space, on the main deck when weather permitted, or crammed into the space below decks when it didn't. Some ships had begun to introduce hammocks by the mid-1500s, a technology adopted from indigenous peoples in the Caribbean that transformed sleeping at sea by suspending a sailor above the wet and hard surfaces of the deck. But hammocks were not universal in the early decades, and many men simply lay on the planking, wrapped in whatever wool blanket or coarse linen they owned, shifting with the motion of the ship, waking when a wave broke over the deck and soaked them through, learning to sleep in the seams between one discomfort and the next. The motion of the ship never stopped, not for a day, not for an hour, not even in the calmest seas. The Atlantic, in the trade wind belt, the route that Spanish ships learned to take, running southwest from the Canaries to catch the northeast trades that would push them steadily west toward the Caribbean, could be relatively consistent in its conditions. But consistent didn't mean gentle. A ship on the open ocean rises to each wave and falls into each trough in a rhythm that is regular enough to become familiar, but persistent enough to never let you forget where you are. For the first days after departure, seasickness was nearly universal. Even experienced sailors could be felled by the particular combination of a new ship's motion, new provisions, and the emotional stress of departure. Men vomited over the railings, slept in their own misery, moved carefully around each other in the tight spaces, with the particular consideration that shared suffering produces. The ocean itself contributed a low, fluctuating roar, the sound of water against the hull, different in character depending on speed and sea state. Sometimes a gentle rush, and sometimes a crashing percussion that could be felt through the planking underfoot. Above that, the rigging sang. Ropes of varying thicknesses vibrated in the wind and produced a continuous harmonic that ranged from a low hum to a high whistle, depending on the wind's strength. And the wooden masts groaned in their steps when the ship changed course or ran before a strong following sea. The sails cracked when the wind shifted and filled again, a sound like something large and flat being struck once and hard. Blocks and pulleys squealed as ropes ran through them. And through all of it, the ship's hull itself contributed its own voice. The creaking of wood under load, the sound of planks flexing against frames, the particular protest of a vessel that was alive in the way that all things under stress are alive, constantly adjusting and readjusting its structure in response to forces it could not resist. Into this world of noise and motion, 100 men tried to eat. The provisions carried on a mid-16th century Atlantic crossing were determined by a practical calculation between what could be stored without refrigeration for 2 months or more and what provided enough calories to keep working men functional. The result was a diet that was monotonous, often barely edible, and chronically deficient in the vitamins that the human body requires to function properly. Daily rations for a Spanish sailor, as documented in records from the Armada of Pedro Menendez de Avilés in 1568, consisted of approximately 1.5 pounds of hardtack biscuit, 1 liter of water, 1 liter of wine, and a shared portion of whatever protein was available that day. Salted fish on Fridays, salted pork on Tuesdays, salted beef or cheese on Sundays and Thursdays. The hardtack was the central fact of a sailor's diet, and its reputation earned its name honestly. Made from flour, water, and salt, baked until essentially all moisture was gone, and then often baked again to ensure its preservation. Hardtack was dense, hard, and nearly indestructible, which was precisely the point. A properly made ship's biscuit could remain edible for months, even years, under the right conditions. Sailors carried it, rationed it, soaked it in water or broth before eating it to soften it enough for teeth and stomach to manage. The problem was that even the right conditions aboard a ship at sea were not reliably maintained. In the humid, warm atmosphere of a ship's hold, the biscuit attracted moisture, and with moisture came the small animals that had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. Weevils were the most common, small beetles that infested ship's biscuit with a thoroughness that contemporaries described with resigned disgust. The standard practice was to tap the biscuit on a hard surface before eating, to knock the weevils out. Men who preferred not to see what they were eating would do this in the dark or simply not look. The weevils themselves were protein, which the body needed, and the biscuit remained caloric even when occupied. But eating it day after day for weeks, watching tiny creatures fall from each piece onto the surface of your meal, required a particular relationship with disgust that many men developed by necessity rather than preference. The salted meat was no less demanding of adaptation. Preservation required packing beef or pork in barrels, with enough salt to prevent bacterial growth. And the salt concentration needed to do this job reliably produced a product that, after weeks or months at sea, tasted primarily of brine. The meat was tough, stringy, and so thoroughly penetrated by salt that eating it without producing significant thirst was nearly impossible, which created a particularly cruel cycle given the scarcity of fresh water. The researchers who have studied period-accurate salt beef in recent years, including archaeologist Grace Sy and colleagues at Texas A&M University, who stored salt provisions on a 19th century sailing vessel for 2 months to observe their degradation, found that after 2 months the meat smelled bad and was visually unappealing, but was technically still edible. Sailors in the 1500s would have found this assessment accurate, if not entirely reassuring. Fresh water was perhaps the most precious commodity on a transatlantic crossing. Each man required roughly 1 liter per day at minimum, and in the heat of a tropical crossing, considerably more. Water was stored in wooden barrels, and wooden barrels were not sealed environments. Over the course of weeks at sea, the water inside them took on the character of its container and everything that container had absorbed. The taste of wood and the particular greenish color that came from the algae that grew in still. Warm water with no circulation. Contemporary accounts describe the water becoming cloudy, then discolored, then genuinely foul-smelling. The experimental water barrel in the Texas A&M study turned cloudy with greenish bits within the 2 months of storage and smelled, by the researchers' own account, pretty disgusting. Sailors who had the choice preferred wine or watered wine to the ship's water, which was usually available in limited quantities, and beer when it could be carried. These fermented beverages were safer in the way that fermented things is safer, the alcohol and acidity inhibiting bacterial growth that plain water could not prevent. Then came scurvy, working silently and invisibly in the background, building its case against every man on board from roughly the first week of the voyage. Scurvy is caused by a deficiency of vitamin C, a compound the human body cannot synthesize on its own and must obtain from fresh food. The ship's diet of hardtack, salted meat, dried legumes, and wine contained essentially none. The body carries reserves of vitamin C that typically last 4 to 6 weeks under normal conditions, and somewhat longer if the person was well nourished before departure. After those reserves are depleted, the first symptoms appear: a general feeling of tiredness and malaise, a vague heaviness in the limbs that sailors attributed to the fatigue of the voyage. Then the bruising starts, appearing spontaneously on skin that was not struck by anything, because without vitamin C, the body cannot maintain the collagen that holds its tissues together. The gums swell and bleed. Old wounds that had healed years ago begin to reopen, the scar tissue dissolving as the connective proteins that held it together fall apart. The teeth loosen in their sockets. The skin takes on discolorations, dark patches spreading across the legs and thighs. The joints ache with a particular grinding pain. An unnamed 16th century English ship surgeon described the progression with the directness of a man who had watched it happen to men around him and to himself. It rotted all his gums, which gave out black and putrid blood. His thighs and lower legs turned black and gangrenous, and he was forced to use his knife each day to cut into the flesh in order to release the black and foul blood. His gums were livid and growing over his teeth. Researchers have estimated that between 1500 and 1800, the age of exploration and the centuries of Atlantic trade that followed it, scurvy killed at least 2 million sailors. Vasco da Gama, on his 1499 voyage to India, lost 116 of his crew of 170, the majority to scurvy. Ferdinand Magellan, on his circumnavigation beginning in 1519, lost 208 of his 230 sailors before the single surviving ship returned to Spain in 1522. The disease was not mysterious. It was the inevitable arithmetic of a diet, stripped of everything fresh and green. What made scurvy so terrible was that its cure had been stumbled upon multiple times and repeatedly forgotten, or simply never acted upon at the institutional level, where it could have made a difference. As early as 1536, the explorer Jacques Cartier, sailing the St. Lawrence River in Canada with a crew devastated by scurvy, was shown by indigenous inhabitants how to make a tea from pine needles that reversed the symptoms within days. The pine needle tea was rich in vitamin C. Some Portuguese explorers had learned, through trial and experience, to plant citrus trees on the islands of St. Helena and other Atlantic waypoints, so that subsequent voyages could stop and take on fresh fruit. But these individual solutions did not translate into policy, and ships continued to sail without adequate fresh food for another 2 centuries. The disease continuing to kill men who could have been saved by a single lemon per day. Disease traveled generally on these ships with a freedom that the men aboard could not enjoy. The conditions were ideal for infection of every kind: close quarters, poor ventilation, sporadic hygiene, water that was a culture medium for bacterial growth, food that was often contaminated, and the simple fact that dozens of people were sleeping, eating, and working within arm's reach of each other for months. Cuts and wounds, which were routine in the physical labor of sailing, became infected easily in this environment. A rope burned across the palm, untreated or treated with whatever remedies were available. Vinegar, tar, cloth bandaging could become a source of sepsis if bacteria found their way in. Respiratory infections moved through a ship's company with the efficiency of any close-quarters environment. Dysentery, caused by contaminated water or food, could sweep through a crew in days, draining the body's resources at exactly the moment they were already stretched thin by exertion and inadequate nutrition. The physical work of sailing was continuous and often dangerous, organized around a watch system that divided the 24 hours of the day into rotating shifts. 2 watches alternated, roughly half the crew on deck and working at any given time, the other half resting or sleeping. The sailor on watch was expected to be fully available for any task the ship required. Hauling on lines when the sails needed adjusting, manning the pumps when the ship took on water through its leaking planking, taking his turn at the helm when a helmsman was needed, and climbing the rigging when a sail had to be altered or a line was fouled aloft. The rigging was one of the most genuinely dangerous workplaces that a 16th century sailor encountered. Rope ladders led up masts that could reach 20 meters or more above the waterline, and the higher you climbed, the more the motion of the ship was amplified. A gentle roll at deck level becoming a wide, sweeping arc at the top of the main mast. Men went aloft in weather that would have stopped any rational person from climbing a ladder on solid ground, because the sails needed handling, and there was no one else to do it. They worked with their feet on a foot rope, and their arms hooked over a yard, hands free for the task, body pressed against the sail, while the ship moved beneath them and the wind drove the canvas against their faces. Falls were not common, but they happened, and a fall from the rigging of a 16th century ship into the sea, which from that height and its sea speed was roughly equivalent to falling onto stone or onto the deck itself, was fatal. When men went overboard, the ship was already moving away from them. There was no stopping a sailing vessel quickly, no practical way to retrieve a man from the water, and so the sea took him, and the ship carried on. The captain of such a vessel was an authority figure of a kind that existed almost nowhere else in the world of the 1500s. At sea, he was the highest power on board, not merely a commander, but a judge, a lawgiver, and in practical terms, the arbiter of whether his crew lived or died. The maritime codes that governed Spanish and Portuguese ships in this period prescribed severe punishments for disobedience, desertion, fighting, theft, and a range of other offenses that might threaten the order of a vessel, on which order was quite literally a matter of survival. Flogging was common and was administered publicly as a demonstration to the whole crew of the consequences of infraction. More severe punishments included being placed in irons below decks, being set ashore in an unknown place, or in extreme cases being hanged from a yardarm. The first offense of sleeping on watch, according to the period maritime codes, was met with a bucket of cold seawater over the head. The fourth offense was treated as a capital crime. The logic was pitiless and correct. A man asleep on watch could miss a storm building on the horizon, a reef in shallow water, another ship on a collision course, and the result would not be one man's death, but everyone's. Beneath all of this, beneath the work, the hunger, the sickness, the enforced proximity, the salt and noise and motion, lay a psychological weight that few of the surviving accounts addressed directly, but that was present in everything they recorded indirectly. Imagine weeks without seeing land. Not days, weeks. The Atlantic crossing, from the Canary Islands to the Caribbean, sailing the trade wind route that Columbus had discovered and subsequent navigators refined, took roughly 5 weeks in favorable conditions. In unfavorable conditions, with winds shifting or dying or blowing from the wrong direction, it could take considerably longer. During all of that time, there was nothing to see but ocean. In every direction, in every hour of light, the same flat circle of water met the same flat arc of sky, and the ship moved through it without apparent progress, because there was nothing against which to measure movement. The horizon was always the same distance away. The water below was unimaginably deep. Men knew this in the way that they knew other things about the world, abstractly, but the knowledge could become visceral and strange in the middle of an ocean, when the bottom was thousands of meters down and there was no land within hundreds of miles. The maps that navigators carried were partial and contradictory. The coastlines of Europe and Africa were mapped with reasonable accuracy, but the New World was still being sketched in as voyages returned with new information. On the open Atlantic itself, there was nothing to map. No landmarks, no depth soundings useful in the middle of 3,000 meters of water, no fixed reference points of any kind. Navigation depended on dead reckoning, the practice of tracking a ship's position by recording its heading and estimated speed from a known starting point, and extrapolating forward through time. Speed was measured using a log, a piece of wood attached to a knotted rope, thrown overboard and paid out for a fixed period of time measured by a sand glass, with the number of knots that passed through the sailor's hands giving a reading in nautical miles per hour. This method was imperfect. It didn't account for currents, which on the Atlantic trade wind route could add or subtract a knot or more from the ship's actual progress over the seafloor. It didn't account for leeway, the sideways drift caused by wind pushing the hull. A navigator who was off by a fraction each day could be significantly misplaced by the end of a 5-week crossing. Latitude could be determined with reasonable accuracy, using a mariner's astrolabe or a cross staff, instruments that measured the angle of the sun at noon or the North Star at night above the horizon, which corresponded to the ship's angular distance from the equator. But longitude, the east-west position, was beyond the practical tools of the 16th century. Longitude requires comparing local time with a reference time, which requires an accurate clock, and the mechanical clocks of the 1500s were far too imprecise to be useful at sea. Navigators knew which latitude they were at. They did not know with certainty how far west they had traveled. The standard practice, developed empirically by the Portuguese as they probed the African coast and refined by subsequent Atlantic crossings, was to sail to the correct latitude and then hold it, sailing east or west on the line of fixed latitude until land was reached, trusting that the geography was where the map said it was. This worked tolerably well when the maps were right and the dead reckoning was not too far off. When neither condition held, ships arrived somewhere other than expected, and sometimes arrived nowhere at all. There was another dimension to the daily reality of the crossing that the records touch on only obliquely, in the gaps between their descriptions of weather and provisions and deaths, the sheer grinding tedium of weeks with nothing to do but wait. Sailors who were not on watch had time on their hands in quantities that were almost impossible to fill. Dice games and card games were played with the intensity that boredom and proximity to danger always bring to idle competition. Men who could read, and literacy rates among 16th century sailors were low but not negligible, particularly among officers and pilots. Read whatever they had brought. Some carried religious texts, prayer books, or devotional pamphlets, the words worn smooth by repeated handling. Others brought nothing and simply sat on the deck in off-watch hours, watching the sea go by, learning by repetition the particular texture of boredom that comes from looking at the same vast emptiness for the 40th consecutive day. Small conflicts ignited easily in that environment, and sometimes burned for weeks. 100 people with nowhere to go but the same 100-meter vessel, under constant physical stress, eating inadequate food, sleeping poorly, worried about storms and navigation and whether there would be enough water. These were not conditions that produced equanimity. Fights happened, resentments calcified. Men who had arrived at the ship as strangers might become, over the course of a crossing, bound to each other by a shared ordeal that created something like kinship. Or they might become deeply and permanently hostile to each other in ways that the ship's tight quarters made impossible to avoid. The captain's authority existed partly to manage these tensions by force of law, but law was less powerful than proximity and accumulated grievance. And the social life of a ship in passage was more complex and more fragile than official accounts tended to suggest. And then there were the storms, The Atlantic is not a forgiving ocean, and the 16th century gave sailors no warning system beyond what they could read in the sky and the feel of the wind on their faces, and whatever accumulated wisdom their pilots and captains carried. A tropical storm building to the south and west could be detected hours in advance by certain signs. A particular quality to the light, a long swell arriving from an unusual direction. The behavior of seabirds that knew the weather before any instrument could measure it, but detected was not the same as avoided. And in the trade wind belt, the storms could move faster than any sailing vessel. When a serious storm struck a 16th century Atlantic crossing, it did not feel like weather. It felt like the end. The waves that built in a mature tropical system could reach heights that made the ship seem microscopic. Walls of green-black water rising above the height of the masts. The ship laboring up the face of each wave and falling into the trough on the far side with a crash that threw every loose object from its place, and every man from his footing. The sails had to be taken in, which meant sending men aloft in the very conditions that made the rigging most dangerous. The mast swinging through enormous arcs, the canvas flogging and snapping with force enough to break a man's grip and send him into the sea. Below decks, the sounds were apocalyptic. The hull groaning under forces that bent it and twisted it, water finding its way through every seam, cargo shifting against its lashings, men braced against the motion in whatever position allowed them to hold on. The pumps ran constantly during heavy weather. All wooden ships leaked, particularly under the stress of storm seas. And the bilge, the lowest internal space of the hull, accumulated water that had to be pumped out continuously to prevent the ship from becoming dangerously heavy. The pumps were worked by hand, by men in the worst conditions imaginable, wet through and exhausted and terrified, doing monotonous physical labor in the dark heart of a ship that was being thrown around by forces that no human effort could resist. The men working the pumps during a storm were in a position that combined maximum physical demand with minimum knowledge of what was happening outside. They couldn't see the sea or the sky, could only feel the ship's motion and hear its sounds and try to keep working until someone came to relieve them, or until the motion changed in a way that meant the storm had passed. Ships were lost. Not often. The voyages that succeeded are naturally better documented than the ones that didn't. But regularly enough that every sailor who crossed the Atlantic in the 1500s was crossing with the knowledge that the Atlantic had swallowed ships before and would swallow them again. Wrecks happened on reefs in shallow water near islands and coastlines, where the charts were wrong or the navigation had drifted. They happened in storms that were simply too severe for the hull to survive. They happened slowly, through gradual structural failure, as the wood of the hull softened and gave way to the shipworm, a marine mollusk that bored through wooden planking with depressing efficiency in tropical waters, leaving hulls riddled with galleries that weakened them until they could no longer be pumped dry. When a ship went down in the open ocean, it usually took everyone on board with him. There was no rescue, no passing vessel close enough to see the distress, no shore within reach. The ocean simply closed over and carried on. The men on those ships knew this. They sailed anyway. The Atlantic crossing, by the middle of the 16th century, had also begun to attract the attention of pirates and privateers, a distinction that depended almost entirely on which government you worked for. Spanish ships returning from the Americas with holds full of silver and gold were among the most lucrative targets in the world, and the Atlantic routes were predictable enough that anyone with a fast ship and the willingness to use violence could position themselves along them. French privateers raided the Spanish treasure fleets with the tacit approval of the French crown. English privateers, particularly from the 1560s onward, added their own systematic pressure to the same routes. Even a ship that survived the weather and the navigation and the disease was not safe until it was through the straits and into the harbor. The anxiety of the return voyage, carrying treasure, carrying news, carrying the exhausted men who had survived the outward crossing and months or years of colonial service, was not less than the anxiety of the outward journey. It was simply differently shaped. What the sailors believed about the ocean they were crossing shaped how they endured it. In the absence of scientific understanding for the strange phenomena they encountered, The men who worked these ships had developed a rich system of signs and portents and superstitions that gave the sea a personality and a logic of its own. A red sky in the morning was a warning. The ancient proverb recorded in the Gospel of Matthew was known to every sailor, and the meteorological principle behind it was real even if the sailors who followed it didn't understand it scientifically. St. Elmo's fire, the luminous plasma discharge that sometimes appeared at the tips of masts and spars during electrical storms, a glowing blue-green light in the darkness, was interpreted as the presence of the patron saint of mariners, Saint Erasmus, and was taken as a sign of protection rather than a cause for additional fear. This was useful. The alternative, interpreting a supernatural light appearing on the mast of your wooden ship during a lightning storm as something to be terrified by, was also available and less conducive to getting through the night. Sailors brought prayers with them and used them constantly. Mass was held each day when conditions permitted, a brief ceremony at which the crew gathered around the ship's makeshift altar and heard the reading of prayers for the voyage, for the weather, for the dead. The dead were a regular concern. A man who died at sea could not be returned to consecrated ground. There was no way to preserve a body for weeks or months in those conditions, and carrying the dead was considered profoundly bad luck. The burial at sea was brief and formulaic. The body was sewn into its hammock or a piece of canvas, weighted with whatever heavy object was available. A few words were spoken. The captain, or a priest, if one was aboard, reading from whatever liturgical text was available, and the body was tipped over the rail. It went into the water with a sound that those who heard it remembered, and the ship moved on, and the horizon remained the same distance away as it had been before. The weeks accumulated. The rhythm of the watch system organized time into manageable 4-hour pieces, and within those pieces, a man could find the small sustainments that made the long passage possible. Songs were among the most important. Sailors' songs, what became known as sea shanties in later centuries, though the form, in the 1500s, was less formalized, served both practical and psychological functions. Hauling songs coordinated physical effort on lines that required multiple men pulling in unison, the song providing the rhythm that unified their movements. Songs that were sung in off-watch hours. In the small hours of the night, when a man was not sleeping but could not quite face being awake either, were something different. A way of filling the particular silence of the open ocean, which was not really silence but was the absence of human sound, the permanent reminder of how small the ship was in all that water. Stories traveled on ships like disease did, from person to person, building and changing as they moved. Men told stories about previous voyages, embellished certainly and adjusted for current anxieties, and about the monsters that sailors' tradition insisted inhabited the deep water. Sea serpents were real to these men not because they were credulous or ignorant, but because the ocean had already proved itself capable of producing things that had no precedent. New lands, new peoples, new creatures, new weather patterns, new stars. If the deep water contained large and unfamiliar animals, and the whale was proof enough that large and unfamiliar animals existed in the ocean, then the detail of their specific shape was a reasonable question rather than an absurd one. Men scanned the horizon for the backs of great creatures, and the horizon gave them nothing to work with, which both reassured and unsettled them. The first signs of approaching land came before the land itself could be seen. Sailors who knew what to look for watched for them the way a person waiting for something important watches any indication of its approach. Birds appeared first. Not the pelagic seabirds that followed ships far out from shore, but land birds, small and fragile, either blown out to sea by storms or traveling between islands, appearing on the ship's rigging to rest and accepting the sailors' hands with the exhausted trust of things that have been far from solid ground. Along with birds came vegetation, floating plant matter torn from coastal shores, the dark shapes of seeds and leaves drifting past. Columbus, on his first crossing, had noted these signs in his journal as the crew's anxiety built toward the end of their 5th week at sea, recording the details with the precision of a man who understood that any indication of proximity to land would be worth its weight in morale. And then, on some morning that was no different from any other morning in the weeks that had come before it, a man in the forward rigging would see something on the horizon that was not ocean. A dark shape, low and flat, against the water, that did not move the way water moved. That was the wrong color. That had a permanence to it. He would call down. The call would move through the ship like water through a fissure, quickly and unstoppably. And men who had been asleep would wake to the news that there was land, and the crew that had been carrying the weight of weeks at sea would find, briefly, that the weight had lifted. The reality of that arrival was never simple. A crossing that took 5 weeks might have killed several men along the way, lost overboard, dead of scurvy or dysentery, burned from the inside by fevers that had no treatment. The men who arrived were not the men who had left. They had been changed by the ocean in ways that weeks on land would not fully undo. Their bodies were depleted, muscle mass lost, vitamin stores empty, immune systems functioning at reduced capacity from chronic nutritional deficiency. Their minds had been in the same small space for 5 weeks, surrounded by the same people and the same sounds and the same view in every direction. And the psychological adjustment to the openness of land took time. Some ships turned back. The early exploratory voyages were one-way in spirit, but practically two-way in fact, because the ships that could reach the New World had to return to Spain or Portugal to report, to bring back specimens and maps, and the men who had been sent out to assess the new lands. The return voyage used a different route. The trade winds pushed west, but the mid-Atlantic westerlies pushed east, and ships that went far enough north before turning home caught those easterly winds and rode them back across the ocean. Columbus had taken this route on his return in 1493, arriving on the European side after some 47 days at sea. Others were slower or faster, depending on the weather they encountered. Others stayed. Beginning almost immediately after the first crossings, some of the men who arrived in the New World did not attempt a return. Some died before a return was possible. Some chose to remain, either voluntarily, in the hope of profit or adventure, or simple escape from whatever they had left behind in Europe, or involuntarily because their captain decided to leave them, or because their ship was too damaged to make the return crossing, or because circumstance simply closed the door. These men became the first European residents of the Americas, not the explorers whose names are remembered, but the ordinary sailors and soldiers and craftsmen who were left ashore when the ship sailed away, who had to learn quickly how to survive in a world they had never imagined existing, surrounded by peoples and ecologies and landscapes for which nothing in their experience had prepared them. The Atlantic crossing was repeated hundreds and then thousands of times across the 16th century. As the decade turned into the century, and the century deepened, the routes became better understood, the ships somewhat larger and better provisioned, the navigation more refined. The trade wind route was mapped with precision. The prevailing currents were documented. The Azores and the Canary Islands became regular waypoints, places where fresh water and provisions could be taken on, and the most severely sick could be left behind to recover or die on solid ground. The return routes became reliable enough that a captain could plan them in advance rather than discovering them through trial and error. What did not change substantially was the fundamental experience of being at sea for 5 or 6 or 8 weeks. The hunger, the leaking vessel, the rotation of watches, the deteriorating water, the creeping symptoms of nutritional deficiency, the deaths that happened quietly, and the burials that happened quickly. The men who made these crossings, first dozens, then hundreds, then thousands, were the physical foundation of everything that followed. The Spanish colonial empire in the Americas, which within decades of Columbus's first landing would extend from Florida to Patagonia, from the Caribbean to the Pacific coast of South America, could not have existed without continuous maritime supply and communication. Every soldier who marched through Mexico with Hernan Cortés in 1519 had arrived on a ship. Every priest who built a mission in Florida or New Mexico had crossed the Atlantic. Every bar of silver that flowed from the mines of Potosi in Bolivia back to Spain making the Spanish crown the richest monarchy in Europe, had been loaded onto a ship in an American port, crossed the Atlantic in the hold of a galleon, and been unloaded on a Spanish quay. The Atlantic had become an artery, and the sailors were its blood. What their crossings made possible went beyond empire, though empire was what the monarchs of Spain and Portugal were primarily interested in. The Atlantic voyages created the first sustained contact between the eastern and western hemispheres since the last ice age had elevated sea levels and separated them. Plants traveled across the ocean in both directions. Maize and potatoes, and tomatoes and cacao from the New World to the Old, wheat and sugarcane and citrus from the Old World to the New, in an exchange that would reshape the agriculture and diet of every continent on Earth over the following centuries. Diseases traveled too, in both directions, though not with equal devastation. The European diseases to which indigenous Americans had no immunity proved catastrophic in ways that took generations to fully understand. Animals were carried both ways in ships' holds. Languages were mixed in Caribbean ports and coastal Brazilian towns, where indigenous peoples and European settlers and enslaved Africans negotiated the terms of whatever common life was possible. The Atlantic crossing was not only an endurance test, it was the physical mechanism through which two halves of the world that had been separate for tens of thousands of years were brought into violent, transformative, irrevocable contact with each other. None of this was visible to the sailor who ate his weevil-ridden hardtack on a Tuesday morning in the middle of the Atlantic, watching the water for signs of land that was still 3 weeks away. He was not thinking about global history. He was thinking about whether there was still wine in the communal cask, whether the pain in his gums was getting worse, whether the clouds on the western horizon were building toward a storm or would dissolve into the afternoon. He was thinking about whoever he had left behind in the harbor that was now so far away that it might as well have been another world. He was doing what people do when the present is difficult and the future is uncertain. He was getting through the day, and somehow, across that vast and empty Atlantic, across those 5 or 6 or 8 weeks of salt water and salted food and the permanent sound of the sea, he managed it. He survived the watch rotation and the hardtack and the scurvy that was always building, and sometimes fully blooming, and the storms that came without warning, and the boredom that was its own kind of suffering. He got to the other side. He saw the birds before the land, and then he saw the land itself, and whatever happened after that, and much of what happened after was difficult in ways that the crossing itself did not prepare him for. In that moment, the Atlantic had been crossed, and he was still alive to see the far shore. The ocean that changed history did not change it by itself. It changed it because men were willing to cross it. Not always willingly, not always understanding what they were agreeing to, not always surviving the attempt, but crossing it nonetheless, in wooden ships smaller than a modern passenger ferry, with provisions that would not pass a modern health inspection, with maps that were wrong in crucial ways, and instruments that could only tell them half of what they needed to know. The Atlantic was crossed by imperfect men in imperfect ships with imperfect information, and the world was never the same afterward. Let that settle around you now. Let the harbor in Andalusia and the 5 weeks of open water and the birds that came before the land all drift back to whatever distance history keeps for itself. The ships have long since rotted in Caribbean harbors or in museum dry docks or somewhere on the seafloor where no one has found them. The sailors whose names we know are few enough and the sailors whose names we don't know number in the tens of thousands. They crossed the Atlantic in conditions that would horrify a modern traveler, for reasons that were usually economic and occasionally desperate. And they made possible things that neither they nor anyone they knew could have fully imagined. They were ordinary people doing extraordinary things under the pressure of necessity. And that is the human story, in every era and in every ocean. If this journey through 500 years of salt and hardship gave you something to hold on to as you drift, curiosity, a quiet awe at what human beings can endure when they have to, the particular comfort of lying warm and still while history moves around you, please consider leaving a like and subscribe if you haven't already. It costs nothing and it helps this channel reach people who might need exactly this kind of quiet company in the late hours of the night. We'll be here next time, somewhere further back in time, and just as close to home. Sleep well. You're on solid ground.